A nation united in its diversity, that was the dream and the vision of the architects of South Africa's democracy as they went about trying to build a nation hurt out of its past and a nation that needed to heal and unite, especially as they moved towards the same goal despite their differences in ethnic, racial and other differences. But is South Africa the rainbow nation that was espoused by the architects of our democracy in 1994? Welcome to this episode of Democracy 30. My name is Oliver Dixon. Thank you so much for being with us. Really do appreciate it. Has South Africa managed to achieve the rainbow nation 30 years after democracy? That is the question we ask tonight. Joining me for this conversations are Dr. Shigane, a lecturer at the Wits School of Governance and the author of Breaking a Rainbow, Building a Nation. We're also joined by Ernst van Zyl from AfriForum. He recently directed a documentary entitled Self-Bestuur, which means to self-govern, which advocates for the self-management under a kind of a federal arrangement. And joining us from Durban is Dr. Rajendran Govender, who's a social anthropologist and also part of the Rapid Response Task Team addressing racism and xenophobia. But before we get into the conversation, take a look at this package put together by our producer Nadia.
We are the rainbow people of God.
A clarion call and a rallying point for a nation divided along racial lines to lay down arms as it rebuilds towards a common future. Soon, the concept of the Rainbow Nation caught fire as the nation, desperate for peace, tried to demonstrate to the world that the 1994 miracle of a peaceful transition could be sustained. The world was our oyster, but the skeletons of our racial past couldn't remain hidden for too long as incidents unraveled, reminding the world of how polarized the South African society is.
The reason why, as COSAT, we're saying we agree the racial issues on the basis that the history background of these incidents, only black people have been killed.
Occasionally, South Africans unite to celebrate their own on international stages, but some believe social cohesion remains a dream until socio-economic equality is realized. From the schools to institutions of higher learning and public spaces, South Africa is littered with revelations of racial incidents. The 2023 Human Rights Trends report showed that there were more incidents of racism reported in the Western Cape than in any other province. It was followed by KwaZulu-Natal and Gauteng in second and third places respectively. Since the July 2021 unrest, racial tensions between blacks and Indians in Durban's Phoenix area remain a concern, with reports of ongoing volatility as recently as July this year. And the ongoing debates about whether or not the farm murders are criminal or racially motivated have seen rising campaigns for self-determination in certain areas of the white community. Some say the colors of the rainbow are beautiful as they are. Forcing their unity where the fault lines haven't been properly confronted is an undesirable or an even impossible task. Nadia Dambuza, Democracy 30.
It's a very complex conversation, a complex question to ask. Do we still have a rainbow nation, and what happened to it 30 years into our democracy? And it might be apt to start the conversation with you, Kotse. You wrote Breaking a Rainbow, Building a Nation. Did we need to break the rainbow to build a nation? Are we still a rainbow nation? Do people use that word still? Do you hear it on the streets? Do the kids say it?
Yeah, so you don't find young people really utilizing that term anymore, and it could be for a variety of reasons. I often say that it's actually the perfect metaphor for the country. It's these 7 colors in the sky looking very, very beautiful, but they never intersect, they never touch, they never mix. And that kind of represents where South Africa is, especially after the last elections, that you can have people all in the same room, but it doesn't mean that you're united. When you live in a country that has the amount of inequality that it has, that are disparate differences between races just based off your wealth. If you're poor in this country, you'll most likely die being poor in this country. If you're rich in this country, you'll most likely stay rich. Obviously, there are exceptions to the rule, but then it speaks volumes about what is this nature of this country that we live in. The other aspect of it is that, does it have to be a rainbow if 80% of the country is one race? This is not to say that one race must now dominate everyone else, but the push for acceptance can't be done at the detriment of the majority as well. And that's a complex
Is that what has
conversation.
happened?
I think that is what has happened, purely on basis on stats. Poverty levels, unemployment levels, inequality levels disproportionately affect black people over white people or any other races. So the question then becomes, after 30 years, how do you then start solving that by having earnest and honest conversations about why is it that race has this really strong proxy for other socioeconomic factors in the country? And if we don't solve that problem, you then kick the can down the road and eventually something will happen. You just need one person to spark an ethnic tension. You just need one person to spark some sort of racial anger in the country, and you'll be forever in this kind of merry-go-round of ups and downs of racial outbursts. Without having that conversation, we're then doomed to do that forever.
Yeah, Ernest, maybe you have the earnest answer to the question and conversation. Kotsi says there that there was a very clear concerted effort to have people socially integrate, and it came at the expense of one race, and that is to say largely black people have had to bear the brunt of integration gone wrong. What does a successful social integration in a post-democratic South Africa look like?
Well, when it comes to post-1994 South Africa, I think we are actually finding ourselves in a very interesting time, specifically in 2024, where for the first time in 30 years, the ANC has lost its majority or its more than 50% majority. And I think that gives hope to a lot of people, in the sense that we've seen 30 years of failure in many sectors, failure to uplift the majority of South Africans, failure to fix many of the serious problems that we are seeing when it comes to infrastructure. Electricity, water is a serious issue that we're now currently actually seeing a worsening crisis growing there. The crime issue that we are seeing, unemployment. I mean, we can sit here and list all the failures, all the problems that South Africa still faces, and all of these crises have one thing in common, and that is that they're not improving. By the year, the statistics are getting worse, and that points to a serious failure on the government side. And I think that's why
Surely society bears some responsibility, a great responsibility for social cohesion, but very specifically for social integration. Has enough been done on that part?
Well, it depends on from which angle you're looking at it. When it comes from the government, I don't think the government should be trying to force integration or force social cohesion in any way. It needs to be organic. It needs to be something that can happen sustainably without the law forcing it to happen. And I think on the ground, when you contrast race relations on the ground in South Africa to the political rhetoric that you might see from some politicians or what you see on social media, I think it's night and day. I think you're looking at two different countries when you contrast that, and that's something that we always need to be keeping in mind.
Dr. Governor, I want to bring you into the conversation here. South Africa in 1994 was very specifically divided along the imagination of the Group Areas Act, because it still was the situation where people lived in their enclaves, whether it be racially or ethnically. You could point in one direction, you can be like, oh, there are all the black people, there are all the white people, here are all the Indians, and maybe somewhere in between you'll find groups and patches of colored people. Does South Africa still look that way geographically and different texturally to what it was in 1994?
No, after a great miracle in 1994, with the advent of democracy, that barriers have been broken and people are free to go and live where they want to. However, there are still townships, Indian townships, colored townships, black townships, where there are people that have a preference to live in those townships because they want to be amongst their own culture, religion, linguistic groups, etc. However, in this scenario, they are not forced to stay there. They are staying there by choice. But from an anthropological point of view, South Africa's rich tapestry of cultures, languages, and traditions is a strength that should be celebrated irrespective where they are living, whether they're living in a mixed environment or in a township scenario. And I believe, like our previous two colleagues have mentioned, social cohesion is central to the vision of the Rainbow Nation. It's about building bridges across different communities, fostering dialogue, and creating a shared sense of belonging. By doing this, then South Africa will be making significant strides in this regard, and ongoing efforts are needed to ensure that every citizen feels included in the national narrative.
Yeah. Khotsi, are those enclaves all broken down and are they gone, with the exception, of course, of Oranje, which ironically is a post-democratic enclave and not a pre-democratic one? Do we still live like that?
No, the best way to kind of view it is if anyone flies from Joburg to Cape Town or any flight, just look out your window. So apartheid spatial planning still exists. All these small towns that exist in the kind of middle of nowhere have the same pattern of the center of the town where traditionally white people lived during apartheid, and then black people who are workers who live on the outskirts of town. Those spatial patterns still exist. So the question then becomes, and I agree with you, but when it comes to can government force people to integrate? Definitely not. People must integrate on their own volition. But government should actively be planning infrastructure development that brings these enclaves together. And that's just in small towns. When you look at big metropolitan areas, even though you see the Sandtons of the world looking very, very mixed, I always ask the question of, to my friends who only have white friends, which I always find funny of, do you know how hard it should be to only have white friends, statistically speaking?
It should be impossible.
It should nearly be impossible to only have white friends your entire life. So the question then becomes, what factors in society are reproducing those types of friendship circles, then it extend to community circles, then it extend to whole-scale areas of the country? And we need to have that conversation of what is reproducing that. It's not just government saying, you know, we don't want to get involved. It is cultures, it is behaviors, it's about who you get exposed to. And when you don't get exposed to the quote-unquote other person, right, someone who looks different from you, you then create stereotypes about that person. You create ideas about who they should be, where they belong in the hierarchy of South Africa.
Just to be clear, I don't assume you say, to your earlier point, if you fix all the potholes in Soweto that white people will suddenly go live there.
No.
So, if anything, and Adam, to you this one, you speak there about organic integration. What would be the catalyst for that? Springbok victory every weekend? How do you get people to organically integrate?
Well, that really depends on your definition of integration. Does that mean that every single square kilometer of the country is perfectly demographic and culturally representative? I don't think that that's ever going to happen, because if you look at, for example, even Soweto, if you look at a culture map of Soweto, there's still roughly, not scientifically, but roughly still areas where certain cultures congregate, and that's how South Africa also is. After 30 years of freedom of movement where you can live where you want, there's still areas where different cultures congregate. And I think as long as the government is not putting any barriers on where you are allowed to live and not, and as long as the government is not telling people where to live and not, then that needs to be left organically so people can live amongst whom they want and where they want.
Should people ever get to decide who can't live amongst them?
I think every community has, to a certain extent, the luxury of exclusivity where they can decide who lives there. If it's now
is that a good thing for democracy or not?
I think it's a good thing if cultures and languages can have the freedom to associate as they want, as the Constitution gives them the freedom to do.
Dr. Govender, should people, very briefly in 30 seconds, we have to take a break here, should people ever have the ability to decide who can't live amongst them?
Yes, I think, it must be the preference of the people, because people would love to live among people that they're comfortable with. But like the previous speaker mentioned, they should not be forced to live like that. Because, for example, if I'm living in a community where I have a temple or a mosque and so on, then I should be living in that because it satisfies my cultural and religious and linguistic needs. However, I should be given that freedom to choose where I should want to live and not be forced to do otherwise.
Khotsi, one-word answer?
This is insane. People cannot decide who's allowed to live next to them. You can live wherever you want, but you can't determine who can live next to you based on various ethnic, racial differences.
Okay. We're going to take a break. The conversation is just heating up. On the other side of this, we continue. And welcome back to Democracy 30. My name is Oliver Dixon. Thank you so much for being with us. We're asking the question tonight, 30 years into democracy, what has happened to the Rainbow Nation? Taking a look really at integration of social integration around cultures, races, and different ethnicities. I want to take your attention to this particular graphic, which gives us a sense of race-related complaints to the South African Human Rights Commission over the last 12 years, between 2012 and 2024. You would see in the early 2010s, 2012, about there was a lower number of complaints compared to later years. Maybe we can, say that spirit of 2010 FIFA World Cup, Philip was still here, maybe, lived on a little bit. But it really picked up around 2016, 2017, 2018, leading up to the COVID years around 2020, and slightly started dipping thereafter. One then has to ask ourselves the question, why does the pattern look the way it does? I mean, it might be because more and more people realized, oh, the South African Human Rights Commission exists. I can lodge a complaint. Maybe just information about it has existed. But as we can see, over the last 10 to 12 years, we've seen a significant increase from the earlier years in race-related complaints. Why do you think that is, Ernst?
Well, why is there an increase? Well, I think that's definitely, it's a matter of speculation, but my best guess would be that correlates also with the rise of social media. Social media has changed over that period of time fundamentally. So you go from a time where a lot less South Africans are on social media, there by 2013, 2014. By 2018, 2019, websites like Twitter, websites like Facebook, websites like YouTube, and then later in our time, TikTok. All of these sites also run on an algorithm or on a click-based, sometimes an outrage-based, sometimes on a drama-based cycle, where I think that's what we're seeing there. If I had to speculate, I don't think race relations are getting worse, and that's why the graph is doing that. I think that probably correlates with increased use on social media and an increase in algorithms actually rewarding racially inflammatory type of posts on social media.
Yeah. Kotze, I perhaps want to ask you this. Do you think over the last 12 to 15 years, South Africans have become more intolerable of each other?
So I don't know if we can use this graph in particular, right? Because to get complaints means someone needs to kind of go through a few steps to get to the Human Rights Commission to lay a complaint. I think a better question is about whether South Africans trust each other, right? Whether they have opportunities to trust each other. You can't trust a stranger, right? You need to trust someone that you know, that you understand, that you interact with, or at least that grouping of individuals. So in my mind, I'm not sure if this is the best way to say whether race issues are on the rise. I think a better question is like looking at different spaces, understanding. Best example is, why is our electoral map today so similar to the electoral map in 1994, just in the distribution of votes, right? That's a fascinating question of 30 years after essentially erasing that electoral outcome in 1994, that you now come full circle to have these ethnic divides over these two fronts in the country. How does it come to when you talk about how people interact? The Springbok game, because we talked about it earlier, is a fascinating example. I love Springbok games, but I'm also very puzzled about like how economics can create racial tensions, that the only people who can afford a ticket happen to come from one racial demographic group that happens to be white, and therefore they're always in the stadium in the majority for a sport that we're trying to push for everyone else. Now the Springboks is an easy kind of political football. I don't want to like use them all the time, but it showcases that you might trust, but these other factors that are exasperating racial issues, unemployment, poverty, inequality, and this is a world over. If you see a particular group has more than you, it creates antagonism between you and them. This is not unique to South Africa, and this is why when we think about race, it's about how do we really solve these other underlying tensions that race sits on top of, that race becomes the marker that we can all see.
Yeah. Dr. Governor, I want to maybe look at specific moments in South Africa's democratic history that highlights some of those racial tensions. If we, for instance, remember the protest at the school in the Free State where there was a clash between the white Afrikaans community and EFF protesters in that moment. Or if we take a look, for instance, at what happened in 2021 during the July unrest where the Indian community of Phoenix very specifically had racialized tension with the black community in the same city, in the same province, and in the same area. So much so that the South African Human Rights Commission found some of those actions incredibly damning. So tension in South Africa doesn't just exist at a racial level, but also at a ethnic level, and some might even say a ethno-nationalist level if we include xenophobia into the conversation as well. Has it gotten worse over time, or did we simply just forget that the problem exists and we are reminded every once in a while when something tragic happens?
Yeah, what basically happens, we are very reactionary. So the unrest in 2021, the racism in schools, the bullying, all these examples, we suddenly become reactionary. So I think what is absolutely necessary is that we need to do everything possible to create a sense and a platform for understanding each other's culture, etc. And I think we need to start at the formative stage of a child's life at school level. At primary school level, LO that is being taught now is not addressing what life orientation should be about. There should be a greater sense of diversity training from school level right up till university, because with the understanding, then we can overcome and mitigate all those racial problems and tensions that we have that are so prevalent, and then suddenly everybody becomes reactionary. So we need to be proactive, and we need to create opportunities for greater understanding at all levels of society.
Adams, in a word, do you agree with that, yes or no?
I think the environment needs to be created where young children specifically are exposed to the many different cultures that they share a country with. I think the only good can come from that.
How do they do that, Adams, if they don't live next to each other?
Well, you can do it through, for example, the opportunity to learn another African language in schools, an opportunity that I didn't get going to public school. And I mean, that's a very, very basic place to start.
Yeah. Khotsi?
Yeah, no, I agree. One is language. Language is a huge one. Not just learning the language, but learning the culture. You need to have the resources to be able to provide that to everyone as much as possible. But that's one avenue. The other one is thinking about how sports bring people together. The other one is about workplaces as well. Workplaces are huge divides of people as well, in an odd way, where people will interact with each other in the workplace, and then when they go into their private lives, don't interact in any particular way. And this is not to say that you must be friends with your colleagues, right? Colleagues are colleagues. But workplaces become these venues in which you can start intervening. The private sector or government need to ask questions about how we're integrating people in the workplace, how are we making sure that people understand their cultures, so that the parents in the workplace then go communicate to
But Adams earlier
on
said you can't force that. By that I mean you can't use legislative and policy tools to be able to do that. That is to say, you can't force people into a workplace through BEE, for instance, and say, hey, go there and get along. If that is the case, Adams, what do you think that social integration in the workplace context would look like if we don't use policies that make people reform, such as BEE, for instance?
I think in the workplace, what will do wonders is to just allow people to live out their different cultures and to be able to live out their identities in a wholesome way, rather than forcing people, for example, to just conform all to one just grey corporate identity. I think creating a bit more room for people to be able to comfortably be themselves in a cultural sense in the workplace will actually facilitate a lot of that intercultural learning and intercultural exposure that will go a long way to...
But if your earlier point is anything to go by, people gravitate towards that, towards those that are like themselves, and people will tend to want to work in a workplace that resembles every other aspect of their life as closely as possible, perhaps their family life. So if we form these monolithic workplaces, how do people have the cultural exchange?
Well, the cultural exchange will happen even if, for example, let's say the Zulu employees prefer to have a friend group where they can speak isiZulu to each other, or, for example, the Afrikaner employees prefer to congregate a bit more amongst each other as Afrikaner employees. The intercultural exposure will still happen in a workplace where they are allowed to freely be themselves, to freely live out their culture, rather than creating a sterile workplace where they are just told to, you have to conform to this grey corporate culture, no aspect of culture allowed, no aspect of difference allowed. I think that actually chokes any form of intercultural
exposure. Do you agree with that, Dr. Govender? In a minute?
What I totally agree, and I also believe that September month, for example, being Heritage Month, culminating into Heritage Day, the schools and universities and workplaces must take full advantage of creating opportunities and platforms for people to understand about each other's cultures. For example, there's some very, very innovative practices. For example, there's some mosques that have open day on Heritage Day where they invite people from other cultures to come and see how Muslims pray, for example. Similarly, temples, churches must have open days for people to come and understand, because it's the lack of understanding that creates tension. And if every attempt, for example, schools, they need to capitalize on Heritage Month, where they need to have people to come and share the cuisine, the costume, the culture. And by doing this, there'll be greater understanding of practices, etc. And then it will eliminate this mistrust and lack of understanding.
So we have 30 seconds. You agree with Aaron's on that?
Yeah, so one, it is not human nature for people to gravitate to who they look like. It's really not. That's a socially constructed way in which people interact. You're not born wanting to just hang out with your race. And the other one is that let's not run into the same trap of doing the same thing we've been doing for the last 30 years and it hasn't really helped. Simply having Heritage Month doesn't solve racial tensions in the country. There's this underlying factor of I can hang out with you as much as I want to hang out with you, but if I know that everyone who looks like me is always going to stay poor, destitute, unemployed, but you don't, or you're always the boss, or you're always in charge, if you don't sort that out, someone will light the flame that you've created timber for. And this is the types of interventions that we're doing now. It's almost like we're laying down the timber for someone to take advantage of, and you just need the right type of leader to do that.
Yeah.
And it's not the country I want to be in.
We're going to have to leave it there, unfortunately. Dr. Governor, thank you so much for your time and your insights. Really appreciate it. Dr. Shigane, appreciate you coming and being with us. Erens, really appreciate you being a part of this conversation. That's where we leave it for now. If you missed any part of this episode, go on to the SABC YouTube channel. It's just SABC News, and you can watch back this Democracy 30 episode. We're back with you. We're back with you next week with another installment of Democracy 30. And in that episode, we ask similarly critical questions around society, what it looks like, how it functions, and how we get the best out of each other as a collective. For myself, Oliver Dixon, it's good night for now. Cheers.